Hey folks, I'm Brett Kinsella, and this is Gain, the Generative AI News Rundown. And with me, I have my colleague, Eric Schwartz.
Brett,
Eric, how are you today?
doing very well. Excited about so much going on.
Yes. Well, this is called the Generative AI News Rundown, but I have a feeling we should just call it the LLM Rundown. I think, though, I'm told by Andrew, our producer, that you're going to do the summary today.
Just a brief little musical setup for to the tune of "We Didn't Start the Fire." I came up with.
Okay, so just don't give me any
I'll just
preamble.
explain it. I'll do it.
Okay, everybody, here's
We
what we're
have
going to talk
Llama
about.
3. What?
Here's what we're going
Yeah.
to talk about today. Eric, go.
Llama 3, Adobe, Microsoft go small with fee, Snowflake Arctic hugging face, Apple has picked up the pace, Amazon Perplexity, Mistral AI, say la vie, too much news drives you insane. It's 11 a.m. Come watch Gain.
Awesome. Okay. So if you didn't catch that, just stick around because we're going to cover all
Yeah.
that and actually quite a bit more. So that was
Oh, yeah.
like a subset of the stories today. I think we've got more than 20 for us to go through. Hey, I'm Brett Kinsella, the founder of Synthedia and VoiceBot.ai. That's Eric Schwartz. He's the head writer at VoiceBot.ai. We've been doing this for a long time. When did you join? 18, 19, 19?
2019, yeah, coming
Yeah.
up on 5 years.
Okay, and I've been doing this since 16, but we've been doing Gain for over a year now, just about every week. We're somewhere up around 60 episodes now. So the Generative AI News Rundown, we give you everything that we think is the most important, plus we give you context behind it. And so I'm going to get right into it here. Oh, before I do that, if you're watching on YouTube or LinkedIn, just give us a like. We appreciate that. But also let us know you're here. I see a comment already from Michael Novak rating your song a 7. I think we're going to blame that probably on some large language model that helps you with that. But
yeah, next time I'll synthesize the music for
okay, great. All right. First thing is, I wrote this over a week ago now, but this is based on Andreessen Horowitz study that they came out, and they started looking at a lot of data in the space. And I just want to talk about this because we're going to go really deep on LLMs this week. But it might be nice to take a step back and just see like what's going on in the market. And so there are a couple different things that I think are important here. So this is what they found. Now, listen, they talked to 70 enterprise buyers. So this isn't like 3,000, so just take statistical significance with a grain of salt. But these are all big companies. And so just giving a sense of what those companies are doing, I think is very instructive. So if you look at it, every one of the companies they talked to was using OpenAI. Pretty straightforward, probably not surprising that they're at least testing it. And 2/3 of those are in production. So Google, a lot, 63% are actually using Google in some way or another. But look at that, just a fraction of those are actually using it in production. Most people are testing Google. They're not using it, which is just the opposite of OpenAI. Llama, about the same, maybe a little bit more in terms of moving to production. But again, Llama, the open model, and particularly Llama 3, we're going to talk about a lot today, so much better. But if you're going to go open, like it seems like probably a pretty good bet that Meta is going to stick around and going to continue to improve those models. But again, people are testing. They are not actually bringing it to market. And then we've got Anthropic, which everyone's testing, but not a lot of bringing to production. And we have Mistral, which is sort of the new kid on the block, and they're actually doing fairly well in terms of bringing to production, given how new they are. And Cohere is just like way out there. But in any event, any reaction to this, Eric?
Yeah, I think it's indicative of how quickly there's been an adoption among enterprise, and also a recognition of how, unsurprisingly, there's money in enterprise. Businesses will pay more, and they have more money to spend. But it's also a combination of how quick off the mark OpenAI and by connection Microsoft was, and also just that it's so new. I think 2 years ago we were just starting to talk about how impressive some of these models were, and now 2 years later, it's not a question of is a business using it. It's a question of what they're using and how experimental they're being and trying out new options.
That's right. And all of these numbers, like it's always important to look at. It's not just like what people are trying, but what they're bringing into production. Shout out to Mikhail Stanislawicz out there coming in from Poland today. Hey, Mikhail, thanks for joining us. And everybody, by the way, if you've got comments, questions, whatever, just throw them into the chat. We'll work them into the conversation today. So just to leave this, we've got all the companies are at least testing OpenAI. About 2/3 of those have got something in production. 2/3 of the companies have at least tried Google, but most are not bringing to production. About 40% Llama, most not in production. Anthropic, almost none in production, but about 1/3 of the companies are at least trying them, which means they're in the game. And this is key because everybody's fighting to be the alternative to OpenAI. Mistral, very interestingly, is brand new, but they are basically ahead of Cohere right now, which I think is pretty fascinating. If we move down, though, we did some additional analysis. It's actually when we look at if we look at basically a relative market share of LLMs in production, OpenAI is actually almost 70% of the market. So when you get a sense that, like, in some ways, like Google at 13% is doing better than I would have thought it was, if we just look at this data. And I think it's probably not as good. I think if you go beyond sort of those 70 companies that Andreessen Horowitz talked about are the biggest, so there's going to be a lot of Google adherents that are like Google Cloud customers that are going to use Google regardless. As we move down the market, I think we're not going to see that. So another thing in here is, and this is something that I've talked to Mikkel, who's in the audience, about. It's a multi-model world. So look at this. When we think about the models, like a lot of people thought, oh, you're just going to choose one model and you're going to use it in your organization. That's not what's happening. 93% of all these companies that are moving things into production are using multiple models. They're using 3 or more. And almost 1/3 are using 5 or more. So this whole idea of becoming the alternative to OpenAI is super important, because if you're that second model in there, you've got a foothold and you can grow over time. All right. The other thing I wanted to point out was this idea of open source. Look at this. 40% expect to increase or already use in majority open source. And another 41% expect to switch to open source when it matches performance. And lo and behold, Llama 3 comes out, looks amazing. Grok 1.5, which is not open source yet, but we expect it to be open source at some point. Looks like that's pretty amazing. We're starting to get to the point where we have the frontier model players are... For those of you who are just listening and not watching, Eric's dog is like creating havoc in the background.
Yeah, sorry, she'll be good now.
But in any event, all these people want open source. Like big companies, they have this idea that they want control. And this is one of the big themes I keep coming across. I've been talking to a lot of chief digital officers, chief information officers, and they're all concerned about control. And so open source looks like a very good option for them if they have the talent and the capability to actually run it and operate it. That's a different question, but it's very attractive to them. So it's likely that a lot of these organizations, the alternative from their primary proprietary frontier model is going to be an open source model. And over time, as they build expertise up in that area, they're going to shift more and more stuff to open source, just from an economic standpoint, but more so from a control standpoint. And if you look at this, why do enterprises care about open source? Look at this, all reasons cited: control, customizability, cost. But if the primary reason, 60% are worried about control. Only 10% are thinking about open source because of cost. Everybody was saying like a year ago, or even 6 months ago, like we have to move to open source because of cost. When in reality, the biggest issues right now are CIOs, CTOs, CDOs are worried about losing control and not being able to, I think effectively, fulfill their fiduciary responsibility to the organization and say, this is what's going on in the organization, and this is how I know that we are not taking undue risk.
Yeah, all it takes is a couple of high-profile nightmare scenarios to make all these executives even more cautious than they probably would have been anyway.
Yeah. Mikkel says open source is in high demand, just waiting for the right quality. I think that's exactly right. And Grok provides speed already, which is also very important too, that latency could go away. Like anytime anybody wants us to set up with Grok. And I actually just met the chief technology officer of Grok. We've got some more stuff coming up on that later, but really fascinating guy and like very interested in what they're doing in the market. Um, and then open source models, topic of future show. Not all open source are really open. Oh, that's so true. I write about this all the time. If you guys read Synthedia, you'll see that there's this idea of proprietary closed models. We all understand that. But we have a lot of people will say they have an open model. And that's because they aren't using like a traditional open source Apache 2 or MIT license. They're providing some riders on top of that, which gives some restrictions, like Meta, for example. Although Meta's is still very permissive for the Llama models. But like, great point, Michael. I'm glad you brought that up. All right, so just a couple more things that we'll hit here. Cloud leads the way. So most model endpoints are going through the API, but 52% are going through this cloud service provider. There's a few self-hosting, but for the most part, people are going cloud first. Although from the model provider, that's almost all OpenAI. So if you look at some of the market share data from December, it actually showed that that OpenAI has the vast majority, followed by Azure using OpenAI. And then just very small amounts from Azure and Google. So it's like, I think it was like 7.7 for GCP and AWS. It was 30 for Azure OpenAI, and it was like 40 for OpenAI Direct. But a lot of that is because the early adopters were software companies that are going direct to that API. I've seen more and more people shifting over to the Azure OpenAI service. However, I will say there's just one issue with the Azure OpenAI service. They're usually just a couple of weeks behind the model releases. So if you want the newest model right away, you have to hit the OpenAI API, because usually it takes 2 to 4 weeks for Azure to roll this out. All right. So spending is also growing. I think this is the last thing I'll do here, because I think we've hit on that. Might not be all HR, but I think that's the key thing, is that in 2023, LLM spend 7 million actual on average, and the expected for this year is 18 million. That, my friends, is the sign of a growing market. And nice transition here. What are they spending all that money on? Well, one of the things they will be spending money on is our friends over at Meta, Llama 3. So, Eric, you wrote about this. I wrote about this. I was at a session at MIT. There was this I guess it was an invite only. It was a conference. There were 1,000 of us, but there were essentially no vendors from a service provider standpoint, just like software companies and like big companies, buyers. And Jan LeCun came on. He was supposed to be there in person, but because they released Llama 3, he just piped in from New York. And we were talking about this. It was really fascinating to hear him sort of talking about a couple of things about this. So first of all, very good from a performance standpoint. In fact, what they're saying now is that the 8 billion, they used to have a 7 billion, Llama 2 had a 7 billion, but the 8 billion parameter model for Llama 3 is as good as the 70 billion from Llama 2. So basically, think about that, like a 9x increase in performance for the small model over what it was. And the 70B is actually getting really close in terms of the performance here. If we just sort of zero in on this, MMLU is the one that most people look at as sort of the standardized benchmark, although you need to look at a lot of benchmarks. Depends on your use case. But coming in that range against for the smaller model, coming in ahead of Mistral 7B, Gemma 7B, which would be comparable models. But if you look at Llama 3 70 billion, you're right up there with Gemini Pro 1.0, much larger model, and the Mistral 8x22B, also a larger model. And then if you look at MMLU compared to Gemini Pro 1.5 and Claude 3 Sonnet, also very, very comparable. So performance way up there. One of the key things they did, though, and this is one of the things LeCun talked about, is they got a lot of that improved performance through more training data. So Llama 3 is pre-trained at over 15 trillion tokens, and there was some quality improvements as well, which were important. We'll talk about quality when we get to Microsoft Phi. But that was a really important addition for them. And by the way, He also talked about their 400 billion, and I think it's actually 405 billion because that's what Zuckerberg mentioned on a podcast the day after it released. But we'll just call it 400 billion because it's close enough among friends. They did a midpoint checkpoint. It's actually not the finally trained, refined model. It's actually a checkpoint, and from an MMLU standpoint, really, really strong in terms of the MMLU 5-shot math, those types of things, and that really above 3.5, approaching GPT-4. So I said a lot there. What do you got, Eric?
No, I mean, you're totally right. It's impressive in terms of its performance. It's impressive in terms of the speed, and again, considering that it's a, if not quite open source, then at least relatively open model is notable, and also just the speed of iteration. I mean, Llama 2 came out really not that long ago, and now it's not. This isn't just like a slight increase. It's like a full step up above in all of its performance, and I'm sure we'll talk about it. But the fact that Meta had already shown a lot of confidence in Llama 2 in terms of trying it out in products and sharing it with third parties, but the full-on integration of Llama 3 into all of its products and services suggests that the engineers and thus the executives are very pleased with Llama 3 and see it as like the marquee LLM product that they'll be putting out, at least for a little bit.
Yeah, and they're showing that this the human evaluation of Llama 3 Instruct, this is the 70B, that when had pitted head to head against Claude Sonnet, Mistral Medium, GPT 3.5, they report that the humans liked the Llama 3 outputs better. There's another thing that showed up, which I think actually could be more important, but it's like nobody talks about it because it's like the model. Like everyone's very excited about the model. They maybe weren't anticipating this big of an increase in performance, but they have a new. They created a new performance benchmark, which they're allowing, and this is more like real world scenarios. It's kind of like what X.AI did with Grok 1.5. They created this new model around vision. So they've got this new around sort of practical use cases. And I think this is really interesting. What we need is the benchmark, the public benchmark options to grow so that we have different lenses based on the use cases. So I think this is really interesting. But I was impressed with the cybersecurity benchmark, which is going to be made open source for folks, because this is an area where there's not enough time spending. I've been working on this a little bit with a big company, and we went through and they'd done all of their testing, got it through their data and trust office and everything. And so they're using generative AI facing the public. And then we went through and applied some new techniques for like identifying vulnerabilities for prompt injection and found all sorts of things. And so I think this is going to be really important for the industry. Now, CyberSec Eval 2 is something that they're making available. There are a couple things that I think are really interesting. So first of all, they found the same type of thing that a lot of the models that they tested that they thought were okay. Once they went through this sort of additional evaluation, they were able to identify more vulnerabilities. Bigger models tend to be more compliant if we're in running code, which is a different type of vulnerability than just a standard like data exfiltration idea. There's a safety utility trade-off. And so this is also like very interesting, this idea of like false refusal. So there are times when you can tune the system or the prompt to be overzealous, and it actually something that's benign that it'll just say, oh, I think this is a security threat. When it really is not. It's actually something that you should allow the user to employ. So you want to have this idea of low false refusal rate, high identification rate for solutions. But I think that this actually might be the bigger contribution they made in the last 2 weeks, because if everybody starts becoming more effective at cybersecurity in this space, it'll reduce a lot of the downstream risk of adoption. You sound like you agree.
No, I do. I'm sorry. I was thinking the cybersecurity element in particular. I think is pairing that with the adoption levels, especially at the enterprise side of things. It's going to be the next big question. Is that the first question is what can it do? The second question is how much can I control it? And the third question is what are the risks? And if you have an effective cybersecurity benchmark test or effective cybersecurity model proof, then suddenly a lot of businesses that can't afford to have a single big cybersecurity issue are going to be a lot more comfortable adopting your model. So, and if Meta can be can claim that they're at least the best if safety is your top priority, then yeah, they're going to have a lot of success with that API.
For them, they just want to be out there and helping the industry along. I think there's other strategy elements we can talk about in a minute. Michael Novak mentioned that Linux Foundation has a new model openness framework, which I think is also very interesting. Although we'll spend more time on that in another session because there are some limitations there that I think are going to impede it from broad adoption quickly. But it's definitely headed in the right direction. I think that's largely all part of the alternative to the NVIDIA stranglehold activity that people are running with, but more on that in a future one because I know we're going to talk about that quite a lot. We also from Meta, just a lot of stuff from Meta. We're getting through it. We're not even going to talk about all of it because there's something I'm saving for next week. But Meta Llama 3 Part 3, we talked about the Meta AI upgrade. So first of all, Llama 2 is going in this, but it's obviously coming out to WhatsApp and Instagram and Facebook. So one of the amazing things about it is that you have it in the channels you already use. Plus, they launched a web client, which I thought was fascinating. So your alternative to Grok and OpenAI ChatGPT and Gemini Advanced, because they just want to be everywhere. They want to always be everywhere. But I was just talking to somebody who's like, oh, geez, it's so much easier for me just to open up WhatsApp and use my LLM search or interaction there than to go to a separate app with ChatGPT because I'm already in WhatsApp. And I think that this is something that people aren't spending a lot of time thinking about. There are some privacy issues you might want to think about because in order to use Meta AI, you actually have to sign up for Meta's whole privacy thing, although much more, I think, acceptable than maybe it used to be. But before I get into the strategy, did you have any comments on Meta AI and how that's evolved?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, shows a lot of confidence in putting it everywhere, including its own standalone thing. It's also, I think, a reflection of once upon a time, you put something on Facebook, that means basically anyone who uses the internet is using it. And obviously that's not true anymore. So if you want to reach people who are not using Facebook or Instagram or WhatsApp, or if you want to reach people who, maybe just use, like to look at pictures and that's it, or, maybe would be interested in the technology, but are averse to trying to join any kind of social media or even a messaging app, you have to at least give them an option. And I feel like I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall in the meeting with Mark Zuckerberg where they say you spent 20 years building this walled garden and expanding it and building the walls higher, making it so that no one ever has to leave it. Well, unfortunately, you have to put a gate in that wall and a little side unmarked garden for people to use because otherwise they're just never going to find it if they don't use your apps already.
That is a great point. And actually, I've been talking a long time on this show and other places about this peacetime and wartime CEOs. And we actually have been in a peacetime period. And when we think about this, not that there wasn't competition, but it was really more incremental benefits and improvements and these types of things. Now we're at war because there's a platform shift going on. And frankly, OpenAI has changed its strategy. I give them full credit for that. They basically pushed as far as they could with their walled garden strategy. And now they're opening it up. Now, there's a number of different reasons why they're doing it. And this probably is a good transition into some of the things where I talked about here, the Meta's generative AI strategy. So the number one thing they want is not to get disintermediated. disintermediate, basically just somebody else, their first spot when they're doing digital interactions is ChatGPT or Google or something like that, because they are an attention-based business. And so they want to make sure that if somebody is using a new service every day, that if it's adjacent, near to what they provide today, they want to be in there. And so that's really why the idea that they have to have essentially this ecosystem. The other thing is they've got distribution, so they have eyeballs. And so, someone like, and this is the whole thing, like with Grok. I mean, like, is Grok the best solution out there for chatbots? No, but there are a lot of people who use Twitter, even if people sort of downplay it. So like they have immediate distribution. Like this was a problem with Inflection AI, which was in WhatsApp, right? That's how I used to use Pi from Inflection AI, was through WhatsApp. But now you can use Meta AI, and maybe that's better. And like,
Well,
is Pi going away anyways? But
I will say though, the flip side of that is that it in some ways it exacerbates existing problems, because of course there's always bots on social media. That's just part of it. But you combine that plus an image creation engine, and now there are stories about people, especially those who are not necessarily the most tech savvy, essentially having a feed that's nothing but AI generated images with prompts written by bots that are just like clogging their news feed, and them being unaware and just thinking it's a nice picture someone posted or created. And yeah, it's sort of feeding on itself that way.
yeah, this is true. I mean, I think social's changing like rapidly, and it's going to change more rapidly. And so they'll be interested to see how it plays out. It is interesting though, because they're basically saying, hey, we have this huge asset, we have distribution, this new thing has come up, we know it's going to provide a lot of value to consumers, is providing value to consumers. Let's just integrate it so it's part of our solution, but also maybe we displace their use of some of these other solutions, at least for the consumer. And you could see this, you could see like ChatGPT potentially becoming predominantly like a business use, and something like Meta AI or something else becoming more the consumer version of this. That sort of goes against that one assistant model that Adam Chire likes to talk about. But it's not it's not an unlikely future. A couple other things around their strategy: build versus buy. Like, why is Meta doing this? Why are they spending all this time in building it? I mean, part of it's control, but it's also that they basically would be the biggest consumer in the world of this technology, and so if they don't build it themselves, they're going to be paying huge fees to somebody else. It also gives them other types of benefits beyond that, which maybe we'll say at the end. Integrated platform. They need this. We're not going to talk about the Meta Ray-Ban smart glasses updates, but we will next week. But they want to have something where they actually have control over. It's kind of like when we had Atul Deo from Amazon Bedrock on the last Synthesia event. He said, we have to have Titan, at least at the time. We were talking predominantly about Titan, because if our customers want something specific, we need to not just have to go to a model provider and ask for it. We need to have like some control over that. And I think that's really important for Meta as well, because they're looking at these other distribution channels at the device layer. Personalization versus information. The other thing about it is Meta has a lot of information: behavioral, psychographic, demographic information, interest graph data about users. So they're actually going to be in a better position to provide personalized assistant services than the other organizations, which would have to actually accumulate this. I mean, Google clearly has a lot of this in sort of different contexts if they could ever bring it together. But OpenAI, it's brand new. So this is something that they're going to, it's going to be a challenge for them. Inflection with Pi, brand new. They have to learn everything as opposed to bring that personalization there. And then added value. They have an erosion issue in terms of users in the U.S. They have some growth and outside the U.S., but those are the sort of the lower revenue markets for them. So anything they can do to counteract, reduce the erosion. It doesn't even have to bring in new people, but give people a reason to stick around or maybe increase their frequency because they have a tool here. All of these things make a lot of sense. And then there's the meta strategy issue, which is they don't want the proprietary models or one other company to basically control the market. For them, just throwing something they have to invest in anyway for all these reasons above. If they throw it out in the market and allow other people to use it, they create a counterweight to these other giant companies that are trying to control the market and have all the users. And so from a strategy standpoint, this is like an option value for them to make sure that the market remains competitive. Okay, everyone. Probably, that was a long monologue. Sorry,
Uh,
I've had a lot
Yeah,
to say
it's
about these things. We haven't talked in 2 weeks,
and
so
yeah, and also, I mean, Llama 3 is a giant stone thrown in the pond in terms of just the ripples and impact it's going to have on so many other things.
yeah. And Bedrock says, the argument able to, Michael Novak says AWS Bedrock same argument able to ingest all models. Possibly, yes. But it's really just I'm making a different point, and that point ultimately is we need competition. One of those things is access, but the other thing is options, options of like models and access to users and those types of things. And it's true that you do increase the platform friction to switch if your personal assistant through Meta AI just is so much better because it knows so much more about you. We'll see. I mean, that's a strategy. It makes a lot of sense to me. All right, folks. This is Gain, the Generative AI News Rundown. Thanks a lot for joining us today. I'm Brett Kinsella, founder of Synthedia and VoiceBot.ai. That's Eric Schwartz, head writer of VoiceBot.ai. And give us a like if you're on LinkedIn or YouTube. We'd love to hear it. If you're on, also give us a like if you're on Twitter today. I think we are. Andrew can nod. I think sometimes, usually Twitter works, sometimes it doesn't. I think it is working today, which is great. I'm happy to see everybody here. Okay. We've just been talking about large language models. I have a feeling we have a lot more large language model news coming up. And we were just talking about Twitter, so why don't we just bring it up? Grok 1.5V, this was like a couple weeks ago, but we missed last week because of travel. Wow, that's improved a lot. 9-10 months after the company founded, they're putting out Grok 1.5, and they're looking at a MMLU benchmark score of 54% versus 57% with GPT-4 Vision, their best solution. Very close to Claude Opus and Gemini. A lot of people were like, geez, OpenAI has wrapped up this market, but we're seeing, and GPT-5 is coming. Okay, fine. But boy, how fast are people making progress right now?
Yeah, and I mean, it's true that the idea that OpenAI has wrapped up the market is obviously not true. But I will say it sometimes does feel like they're definitely still setting the conversation, because the GPT-4 visual model came out, and then a few days later this came out. So it may have been already on the schedule, maybe just a coincidence and timing, but it does feel like if they were planning to wait a little longer, or had a few more tweaks they wanted to make, or a little more testing to do, they may have said, no, we'll put out right now and say, hey, look, we're just as good as OpenAI. And if you were thinking, well, I want to pick one, and I was thinking about Grok, but OpenAI has this model, now you don't have to make that choice because we can do the same thing they do.
Yeah, I 100%. And the other thing too is that I think I called it Grokmentum. Maybe that'll get into the vernacular if they actually get momentum, because they need to move beyond just using it themselves. And like, it's not clear to me what their path is for that. Although, like, you put out a quality model like that and open source it under Apache 2 license, you'll start to get a lot of people using it. Plus, they've got some data sets other people don't have because of the Twitter data, and that might, although it sometimes has downsides because there's a lot of garbage on Twitter, so they have to figure out good filtering. But I think it's like really interesting. But the bigger thing is they have access to all the Tesla vision data apparently.
Well,
so they have more real world image data than anybody.
And not only that, but apparently Elon Musk said that they want to actually use the Tesla computers to help process all that data too.
All right, and so we're talking about the Grok Assistant, Meta AI Assistant. Mikhail Stanislawic says we are now used to assistants that you need to talk to. I believe there's a future where assistants are just present and help us when it's needed. That's like, I think, the idea of the co-pilot, the proactive co-pilot, the agent. All of these things are going to be there, and they're ubiquitous. It's so astounding. Like the things that we're doing, like you just think about like ChatGPT, how revolutionary it's going to look so quaint in a couple of years based on what's happening.
Well, and it's funny because that's also the description from 1600s of aristocrats describing the perfect servant. You never say anything; they just know what you need and are doing it before you even say anything.
Exactly. That's the whole thing about assistants that actually really know you. And today we have these essentially undifferentiated assistants, which are very good at things when you ask them for them sometimes. And maybe Rabbit will be it. And again, there was a Rabbit launch this week, which we will talk about next week, because we just get so much language model stuff to talk about. I'm not even going to get to like the earnings news from this week, but this is interesting. And Mikkel just hits it. We are entering the age of model abundance. And I think that's true. It's not just high quality models, it's a lot of high quality models. And what I would put them in the category of is this good enough standard, that they are sufficient to meet most use cases. And what we found was that GPT 3.5 is kind of a good enough model for a lot, but we'd really like a GPT 4 level quality for the good enough because it's like so much better. We just need GPT 4 quality, lower latency, kind of like GPT 3.5, and then we just significantly expands all the use cases. And what we're seeing now is a lot of these open source and proprietary models coming out. We have another one from Mistral, 8x22B LLM. And what they're focused on is this mix of performance and efficiency. And efficiency is basically how many parameters are active, which drives latency, which drives cost. And, of course, they rate themselves well in terms of the way they lay out the diagram and the different types they do. But if you look at it, the 8x22B, and this idea here is that like the 22 times 8 is the number of parameters, but it's actually only 40. The 22 billion times 2, that's why it's like 22. There are only 2 are active at any given time. And so this is like these mixture of experts models, which GPT-4 is a version of that, just a much larger because the total parameter count is 1.8 trillion. So even if you use 2 active, like it's still a huge LLM. The MOE model is like necessary for them to even like run it, even though it's still slow. I think GPT-5 is going to like be like wild in this front. But if you look at Mistral 8x22B, MMLU 77.75. I mean, this is insane. Basically for 44 billion active parameters in any given time, being able to do that much. And I've been watching some of Arthur Mensch's, he's the one of the co-founders of Mistral, some of his interviews, because he's been making sort of the YouTube and conference circuit. And one of the things he talks about is basically like they don't have the resources to build like the frontier models yet, but they do have the knowledge and resources to build really efficient models. And we're starting to see more and more come out along those lines. How can it be really good, but also fast and not cost a lot?
Yeah, I would just say 2 things. One is that a lot of what Mistral is doing feels like they're doing essentially auditions for all those giant government and intergovernmental contracts that in the EU, the multilingual element, the efficiency, costs, etc. And also, as a reminder, this wasn't a big PR push. They literally put a post on X with a magnet link to 281 gigabyte file and said, "Here you go." That was it.
Well, the funny thing about it is, like, Mensch talked about that. He was asked on a podcast about, like, so why did you do this? Was this some sort of some master plan? He said, no, it was a joke the first time we did it because when Llama 2 70B came out, it was only for researchers, but then someone got access to it and they put it out on a Tor link just so everyone could have access to it. And we thought that would be sort of a funny homage to the rebels out there. And but then they realized, they're like, oh yeah, people really like this, and so it is sort of a brilliant type of thing.
It is feels the most French way to do it, to be honest.
Well, maybe irreverence. Michael Novak was asking about is this like the model abundance, is it English only? And like I think that's largely true, but multilingual catching up, Mikkel says, but like, of course, like not Polish. I mean, Polish has still got a long ways to go. Let's face it.
Polish, one of the hardest languages to translate, of course.
Well, this is also true, but we need to support Polish as well as many other languages, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But the Mistral 8x22B has actually got some really good scores across French, German, Spanish, and Italian. So that's really good to see. And I haven't seen comparable numbers for Llama 3 70B, which I assume are going to be much better. Okay, let's talk about SLMs, small language models. as our friends at Microsoft like to call them. Although the folks at Google, I was just with some of the Google folks working on Gemini, and they like to call them baby LLMs, like the Gemma models are big. So I think we're still going to be working on this because what's a small? It's 4 billion small. It's not small compared to the other language models we used to have, but okay, we'll just call it small language models because Microsoft has a bigger.
That's much better than baby. Baby implies it's going to get bigger.
Yeah, that's true. It's going to grow. That's true. If you just say it's small, it can stay small. But if it's a baby, you have to nurture it and then like send it to college and spend $250,000. That's a good point.
Babies grow fast, and that's not really the point of these.
Okay, so 5.3, there was this whole thing that I was talking about. Like, I can't remember who it was, and I was trying to find it, but I couldn't find it. Someone's like, Satya Nadella just invested $10 billion more in OpenAI and is wondering what the $10 billion he'd spent over the previous 3 years in his own internal AI research team was doing that they weren't able to put this thing out. But they have done a lot. In fact, they've done even more recently with 5.3. We saw 5.1 last fall and then 5.2 in December, which kind of looked like experimental activities. And a lot of times those experiments turn into real products. I think 5.3 mini is going to be kind of amazing. The research paper that put out in a lot of the headlines really talked about small enough to run on a phone, essentially, which is true. And I think that's sort of a theme that we're seeing, a bifurcation of the market. Well, it's actually another segment in there, but we've got the high-end frontier models that are just the best. We have models that are a little bit smaller. We'll call that a step down, but faster and cheaper, and like good enough. And then we have these small models, which are really going to open up a lot of use cases. And actually, I just saw someone who'd downloaded Llama 8B onto their laptop, and they're like amazing at how good it is. And it's and this enthusiasm people have, that's what's going to drive this market forward. You have to understand it's not just, is it good, but people have to be enthusiastic about these things. So 5.3, really good, like the 5.3, it's coming in 3 models. The mini was 3.8 billion, the small at 7 billion, and then the medium at 14 billion. So a medium-sized model is now 14 billion, which is sort of also interesting, at least in their parlance. But if you look at the MLU scores, 68, 75, 78 for those 3, an increasing order of parameters, those are really close to GPT 3.5 at 71.4. So even the smallest model at 3.8 billion. Now, GPT 3.5 Turbo, I think, is actually a 22 billion parameter model, at least active. So it's a very scaled down version, but they were able to get good performance and a better at a better cost and latency perspective. But if we're looking at 5.3 medium, 14 billion, which is in preview, that's a better MMLU score than GPT 3.5. That's really fascinating. It's not as easy. Like it's, you have to run it yourself, and there's all these other things. But this is fascinating that now we've got these small models which are outperforming these good enough models, like at the GPT 3.5 level. People can have total control. We started our conversation today about how enterprise buyers want control. The cost per performance ratio is so much better. And we have this other thing where Microsoft makes more money if you use 5.3 potentially down the road, if you're hosting it, right, because of the margins. Now, you can also open source license for some of these. But what are your thoughts on this, the small language model revolution?
I think that it ties into 2 things. One is that we talk about things like being good enough, where it's like you don't need the most powerful, the largest all the time. Sometimes your needs can be met by something smaller, in which case, great, faster, more efficient, cheaper. And then also going back to those enterprise charts, the control issue. If it's small enough that, depending on the size of the company, if it's small enough that you can host it on your own servers, have complete control over how it interacts with the cloud or other things, then suddenly your baseline level of control of the model goes up significantly and gives you a lot more opportunity to tinker with it, to customize it as you build up expertise in doing so. So I think I'm not sure necessarily that they'll be the most common or the most mainstream approach to generative AI models, but I do think that they'll have a secure part of the market of the ecosystem for AI.
Absolutely. Okay, so these are at least the 5.3 Mini is released under the MIT open source license. Very permissive there, so people can just use it what they want. I presume the other two will be, but although we have seen that where sometimes like the smallest model comes out and that's open source, and then one of them hits a proprietary level. The other thing too is like, how did they do it? And this goes down the theme that you and I have been talking about for a while. We started out with parameter count driving model performance. And then we saw that Google was the first to recognize this, like adding more tokens really improved performance. And then we saw this mixture of experts model, which is more of an efficiency play as opposed to a performance play, but it winds up in terms of a performance output as well. We saw this architectural revolution going on. Everyone's doing MOE models right now as opposed to the old unified models. And what we could see, Sam Altman said this on Lex Friedman's podcast a year ago. He said, actually, we think that like data quality curation is going to be one of our differentiators. And you saw them like acquiring a lot of high quality data. Well, what did our friends at Microsoft do? They actually had 3 trillion tokens. So it's a lot of data, particularly for small models. And Jan LeCun in that meeting I was in last week said, hey, by the way, everyone thought that you could only have this certain factor of tokens to parameters, and there was sort of an upper theoretical limit. Well, it turns out you can just give them more tokens, and they do a lot better. And so having more tokens is really important, but they also had a high quality, or they much more quality control on those tokens, those 3 trillion tokens. The Microsoft researchers had put out a paper last year called Textbooks Are All You Need. So everyone knows attention is all you need. That's what that led this revolution for generative AI, this attention mechanism for autoregressive LLMs. That's what has led to most of these improvements. But the Microsoft team was looking at it saying, hey, you know what? The quality of that data, we can draw a direct connection between quality and quantity to performance. And that just means you need fewer parameters.
Yeah, the period where parameters size was the be all end all of models definitely seems past now. We're into other metrics for that.
Okay, we're going to start going into rapid fire here. Apple made an acquisition this week. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, this is actually the second generative AI related startup that they bought, but in this case they bought a French company called Datakalab back in December, and it's finally become more public. We don't know how much they bought it for, but it's a company that was all about making more cost-efficient, faster computer vision solutions and related to other data comprehension. So Apple now will have all of that, and presumably quite a few of the engineers behind it as well. So I suspect that will speed up Apple's own plans, which as always remain unknown and it feels like a running joke now about like, here's whatever other tech giants doing generative AI, and what's Apple doing? Well, they have some updates to Siri. That's it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and we're going to go into rapid fire now. You get 20 seconds per story that we're going to hit, and then we're going to hit like a couple of ones. We'll save a little bit of time at the end. Folks, this is the Generative AI News Rundown. Join us usually on Fridays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. I'm Brett Kinsella, Synthedia VoiceBot. That's Eric Schwartz, VoiceBot. Give us a like if you're on YouTube or Twitter or LinkedIn. We'd appreciate it. Also, you can find all these articles on voicebot.ai or Synthedia. And then we have some external articles too, but they're all linked within those. And then I have a newsletter and LinkedIn, which I usually try to compile these in. So some way or another, you can get it. And then you can always watch the recording if you join late. All right. So just a couple more cleanup items for LLM world. You had a story about AWS and Bedrock?
Yep. Yeah, AWS and Amazon doing exactly what we were talking about. You can bring in your own models. You can get better help evaluating them and filtering them. So there you go. More control, better opportunities to create the model that you want.
Yeah, absolutely. OpenAI, new assistant API. This is actually turning some heads because it's basically things they said that were shortcomings last fall, and all of a sudden now they're features.
Yeah, the idea that you can control where your AI model is going, and the idea that you can set parameters in place so that you don't overrun your costs by just it's very easy to use up quite a lot of tokens on with generative AI models, and so now you don't have to worry that you'll accidentally get a giant bill that you didn't expect. So it's again, more control, more ability to decide how and where you use your AI models.
Perfect. Okay, now let's get into the funding fountain. Our friend Paul Sweeney says, great roundup, as always. Thanks a lot, Paul Sweeney.
Thanks.
All right, so let's talk about two generative AI coding solutions that just raised big money, big valuations.
Yeah, Cognition Labs, 6-month-old company. They just raised $175 million and claim that they're worth $2 billion. It's a kind of a crazy story just on the sheer speed of it, but yeah, they made a bit of a splash with their coding assistant named Devin a couple months ago. There are rumors that they were offered an investment recently that only valued them at $1 billion, so they turned it down. So now, but they're going. Founders Fund is going all in, so that's Peter Thiel's funding, I guess, engine, and among others, of course. But it's a lot of money, or a lot of valuation money, and a lot of hinting at major contracts to come for Cognition.
Mm-hmm. And new startup, Augment.
Yes, yeah, Augment, another brand new, or at least coming out of stealth, brand new. Raised a ton of money. The new amount of $227 million on top of an earlier $25 million. They're almost $1 billion, but they have some interesting backers as well, including Eric Schmidt's own innovation endeavors. And again, it's about, hey, what's the best way to use generative AI models? Well, what's the most annoying and complex thing that involves a lot of tedious work? Coding. So any way to streamline that, make it cheaper, faster, there's going to be interest there.
Absolutely. All right. So we also have Parloa. This is really interesting for those of you in the voice space.
Yeah, one of those names too that's sort of a evocative. I kind of like that. It's it's almost parlay, but it's not quite. Mm-hmm. But yeah, again, another major big question. Hey, what's the best way to use generative AI and a complex, or sometimes tedious but necessary tool? And that's customer service, for all the basics of customer service, where it could be done by an AI without any concern over complex issues. So Parloa raised a bunch of money to really expand that work in terms of contact centers for customer service. They're going international, and it's about voice, it's about chat, and honestly, the line between we're a text and we're a voice service is blurring now to the point where it'll be, I think, essentially gone pretty soon.
Yeah, and I'll just add something here, because I've been in some conversations about this. Like, Parloa is actually different than what a lot of people think it is. It's actually streaming in real-time translation. And so particularly if you're supporting, like, from a centralized call center, a number of markets that have languages where you don't do 24/7 staffing for those language things. So think about, like, the Baltic states, the Balkans, like a few other places where you might during the day staff people if you want to do 24/7. Like, how do you do that? Because it becomes really expensive, because they don't have huge pools of speakers in those spaces. So if you actually have to have a human here, and this real-time translation is actually significant. So I recommend people take a look at that, because it's different than just like hooking it up to Google to translate or something like that. This is streaming real-time conversion, so that you can actually have speakers of any language work with customers in any other language. I think I think this is the first of many large upswings in their valuation, because there's not a comparable solution right now.
And again, the European companies thinking more about translation maybe than the US based companies.
Absolutely. All right, NVIDIA, RunAI.
Yeah, another acquisition. This time we know how much, 700 million. And yeah, NVIDIA is the engine of the world economy, I guess now. But it's a way for NVIDIA to not only dominate in the chip space, but to enhance on the sort of the software side, in terms of again, better control over how these models become applications, and how those infrastructures work and how they're managed. And I think it's it's NVIDIA not resting on its laurels and saying, like, okay, well, we've done our domination here. Now let's see how much we can dominate another facet of generative AI.
All right, Perplexity. I was actually with the Perplexity CEO, Erwin Srinivas, last week. We talked a little bit about this right before it came out. This move into enterprise is a big driver of this. We talked about Perplexity a couple weeks ago about already unicorn status. They basically doubled their valuation in the last 4 months. And we saw that a lot last year, but we have not been seeing that this year. This year, if anything, there's been a contraction in valuation growth or even flat valuation growth for a lot of these companies as they realize it's like hard to get customers. It's not just about the technology. But they closed another 62 million at a 1.04 billion valuation. The key thing is they've got 50 million users. We already knew that. 10 million in annualized revenue. At least there's like information floating around the market. Perplexity Pro is going to 32 million SK Telecom users. That's a big thing because once these people start to get used to Perplexity, they're going to want something like that as their search engine. A year from now, when that's not free, I have a feeling a lot of those people are going to convert to paid. They might do advertising revenue, but I think the biggest deal here is that they're going into the enterprise. Now, I will tell you the one downside of this is that it's just for search. It's not like you're not plugging this in with your RAG to do your own internal knowledge bases. This is just for web search. And so it's actually kind of expensive at $40 per user per month just to have more effective web search. But if you're like a research organization, you deal with a lot of third-party information outside of your org, I can see where this would pay back very quickly.
They're aiming to be like the ability and flexibility of Google as a search engine, but in a form that takes advantage of what generative AI models can do.
Okay, so we also have Microsoft showed off generative AI model that makes deepfake videos from still photos. This is basically DID. They basically reinvented DID 3 years later, right?
Yeah, they reinvented it. It's again, but as always, what's impressive when these new versions come out is that they keep getting faster and better with less information. I mean, I was playing around with it a little, and the emotion side of it, which story won't get to now, but the convincing emotion in a face is genuinely kind of crazy because considering it is just a still image, one still image, just not necessarily like a lot of expressions on a human face, but it's casually convincing, and I think they're going to get even more casually convincing deepfakes soon.
Absolutely. Let's do 10 seconds on the two Adobe stories.
Yeah, Firefly images, really good, and talk about convincing. And it's really just a question of how much time you want to spend on it. But as much time as you spend on it, you will get some really impressive looking photos.
And the Acrobat AI assistant finally came out this a couple of weeks ago, but like it was announced a while ago. Some people had early access, but now it's generally available, right?
Yeah, this will be, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how much it gets used because, yes, often, especially large documents, it feels like are put into PDF. PDF is still super popular. If you can have a little sidebar and say, can you explain what's going on in this? I don't want to read, 1,000 pages of whatever, then that's great.
I was just speaking at a conference this week and I was like, and this was people who aren't really into AI. And I said, listen, a really easy way to think about this is revolutionary because now you can have a conversation with your documents, conversation with your spreadsheets, conversation with your databases. It's like revolutionary in terms of saving time. Tell me about Maestro.
I honestly, I don't want to sound like just a booster for these kinds of things because there's always issues, but it's really cool. I really like Maestro. I really like how it not only will make a playlist for you based on a text description, but also an emojis you can use, and even just like describing what kind of thing you want with like colors or things like that. It'll put it together, and not only will put together, it'll put a pretty good title for the playlist. And it's going to become more common. Spotify is something similar, but like the idea of just like this is how I feel. Play me music for that. The end. It's going to change how people listen to music, I think.
Sangeeta Dworkin says, this is great. Quick content digestion with rapid fire. Yeah, we went deep for the first part of this. And now because we went so deep, we have to go fast to get through a bunch of these things. We're not even going to finish everything. By the way, Maestro, we showed a demo of that. I did a webinar yesterday with Amazon. And Maestro was one of the things. By the way, there will be a piece coming out in Synthedia about the intersection of entertainment and LLMs. this weekend. There's a new Synthesia framework around this for how you think about it and how all these things do. Maestro is a really interesting example, and I can provide a link for anybody who wants to watch that. The video replay of that as well. I think you'll find it pretty interesting. We'll talk about that in more depth probably next week. The other thing we'll talk in more depth about is this webinar we did actually the week before or last week around no code RAG. And so if you don't know RAG, it really deserves more attention than we have time for today. Retrieval augmented generation. This is how companies are largely using generative AI today. We have I go deep here in like what the research is, but also have a video. If you just go to the voice bot in Synthesia channel on YouTube, you'll be able to rewatch that video. I think you'd be very interested in how Alden Do Rosario and the ChatGPT or the CustomGPT team has done that. So definitely take a look at that. But we'll bring that back next week. Winners and losers of the week.
Winner, Meta, definitely. I think even if some of their things have issues or people are a little annoyed by it, the fact that it's just like a lot of the apps that people just use daily will at least give them an opportunity to interact with Meta AI. The fact that all these companies who are looking for something like Llama 3 have now that it's there. I mean, Llama 3 is going to be a big deal. So I think that's my winner for sure.
Okay. Yeah. And I'll go, I mean, that's sort of an obvious one I would like to do too, but I will say Microsoft, because I think the Phi models really show that the research there is starting to pay off. So we'll stick with that. All right. So loser of the week.
I'm gonna have to say Google. I know we didn't get to it, but one of the things that's going on there is a major reorganization that's basically around generative AI. And while it may be ultimately a good thing, it feels like a lot of the stories I'm hearing is it's kind of chaotic there right now, and a lot more uncertainty about where things are going to land after the reorganization. And they've already done a lot of layoffs, and it feels a little edgy to be part of their future right now.
Yeah, that would have been mine too. I'm actually going to go with NVIDIA. The rise of small language models, they still might train on NVIDIA GPUs, but you won't need them for inference. And that'll be revolutionary because that'll address the cost issue, but it will also address the supply shortage issue that we heard about yesterday from Microsoft, saying they can't basically get enough GPUs to meet demand in their cloud services. Actually, the big winner is like Microsoft. I even say it's not just the Phi models, but like their cloud is growing, and like a third of all their growth in cloud is driven by AI. And actually, the other part is actually driven by AI too, because most of those are new customers who are coming in using it just for access to Azure OpenAI service, and then they start running other services on. These are people who have never or have not recently used Azure in any meaningful way, are now taking a look at that again, and I'm seeing that in a number of places. All right, folks. I think that's it for us today. Thanks for coming out. Appreciate that. Give us a like on YouTube, Twitter, and LinkedIn on your way out. Let us know what you are thinking about in the comments. Send us notes anytime. Read Synthesia and VoiceBot. I think that's it. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.